And people say, well, if your last name is Mato-Toyela, how are you Cherokee? Well, that's from my mom's side of the family. Actually, her father is Lakota and Ojibwe, and her mother was Kuna Indian from Panama. So we have family from all over the place. My wife's got family from Michoacan, Mexico. They're Tarascan Indians. They have a really neat culture. One of the last tribes to ever even be considered assimilated into modern society these days. Kind of neat. But anyway, the first thing I'd like to do for you guys is something that most of the Mound Builder Society people do when they meet new people and they have a big celebration, is they welcome them in. And I'm going to do that with my my shell phone here off of SpongeBob. Yeah. You hear some ocean in there? Okay. Anyway, I'm going to welcome you guys. So anybody with a a hearing aid or anything might want to crank it down just a little bit. Don't want to do that too much because I had a guy yesterday told me that he thought it was a warning siren, and he was way over there. So, but anyway, this is the sound originally from the first shell phone. We could use them to call each other. It's a conch shell. It's something that was traded for. They don't live around here. But so are a lot of the items that you see inside of the mounds there. They're from here. They were discovered here and have been here probably for hundreds of years, but some of them may have come quite a ways. One of my favorite ones is a piece of red pipestone, which is actually near where my mother's father, his family lived, out in Wisconsin, Minnesota area. It's a piece of red pipestone, and there's a neat little red pipe in there. But anyway, so that's my my conch shell. I would like to tell you a couple of stories today too, and as I was telling my friend Greyhawk yesterday, we have a lot of similarities, and like he mentioned earlier too, that there's a lot of similarities. One of my favorite one is the word for thank you. We say wado, and then his people say mado. It's the same, sounds really similar. We have flutes and musical instruments and a lot of ideas, concepts. The whole idea of mound building, lots of these things we've shared over hundreds and if not thousands of years. But there's a story that I like, and the story that I'm going to tell you is actually one of the origin stories of Native American people, and it's one of my favorite ones because I told you my last name is Mato-Toyela, which actually means blue bear, and it's an important name. It's something that signifies who I am and what I do, and family, and lots of stuff like that. It's kind of interesting, but it comes from my mom's side of the family, and one of my favorite stories that has similarities here in the southeast is one from out northwest, out near Washington State. And it talks about the beginnings of this continent when there were no people here. And, it was just a barren, very frozen, very cold land. And there was a great being that come down out of the sky, and we've always called him Skyman. I guess we never knew his name really, but we called him Skyman. He'd come out of the sky, and he would come down and visit our beautiful land here where we all live these days. And when he comes down, he thought, this is such a great place, maybe I should bring my family here. So one time he decided one season to bring them down, and Skyman and his family had children and his wife that lived in this big mountain. We call it a lodge because it looks like our teepees out west, but it's a big mountain that he lived in. And this big mountain, sometimes you would know when he was around because there would be smoke coming out of the top of the mountain. And a lot of you might think, well, that sounds kind of like a volcano, but we knew it was Skyman who was living in there. So he had come down and brought his family this time and decided to tell them, what the planet here was like and how everything was and the beautiful scenery and everything we have. And when he brought them down, it was really, really a barren land, but he decided to make it more beautiful for them. He went out walking one day, and he'd never let his family come out of the mountain. Only he would come out because he knew it was a dangerous place too. So he come out of the mountain with his walking stick, and he was walking along, And as he would walk, sometimes he would stop for a minute and he would break off a little piece of the walking stick and throw it in the water. And when he threw it in the water, this little piece of the walking stick would turn into fish and they would swim away. And then sometimes he would break a bigger piece of the walking stick off and he would throw it in the water, and it would become beavers, and they would start making dams and living their beaver lives that they have. And sometimes when he would walk, he would poke the stick down through the snow until it touched the ground. You guys don't know much about snow out here, I'm sure, right? But he would touch the ground with it, and when he touched the ground, a great tree would pop out of the middle of it, like the giant sequoias we have out west. So he was walking along, and sometimes he would drag it and make a river out of the end of his walking stick. Skyman was a pretty big guy. And then one year, he was inside of his lodge with his family, and it was an incredibly cold year at that time. And when the wind was blowing, it kept blowing out his fire in the middle of his lodge. And he thought, well, this is getting really too cold for us. So he sent his daughter to climb up on the inside of the lodge up towards the top, so she could look out and ask the wind spirit to slow down and not blow so hard, so they could have a fire and keep warm. And the wind spirit was always mischievous in our cultures. He was one that kind of did, played some tricks on us sometimes. But he told his daughter before she got up to the top, don't lean out too far, because sometimes the wind spirit may grab your hair and he'll tug you off and I'll never see you again. And she got up to the top, and she respected her father and was heeding his warning, but she also remembered him telling her the story about how beautiful you could see the ocean from the top of the top of their lodge. So she leaned out probably a little bit too much, and the wind spirit came along and grabbed her and took her off, and she was gone. And the father was very upset and looked for her everywhere and just really couldn't find her. So he stayed inside of his lodge with his other family, the rest of his family. And meanwhile, the daughter of the Skyman, she had fallen down to the base of the mountain, and she had kind of befriended the bears that lived there, And the grandmother of these bears took care of her and basically nursed her back to health. And eventually she lived there so long that she married one of the bear people, and they had children. And they weren't quite as hairy or ugly as the bears, and they didn't look exactly like her, but they were very interesting little people, and they were her children. So the grandmother of the bears decided it was time that she needs to go tell Skyman, I found your daughter. So she went up and brought him back to the lodge with all the other bears. And at this time, the bears were always walking on just two legs. They weren't really four-leggers like we call them today. But at that time, they were always on their two legs, walking around and picking herbs and berries and everything, and doing what bears do now, but from a little bit taller standpoint. When the grandmother bear brought the Skyman back to their lodge and showed him his daughter, he was so happy and overwhelming, to see her and hug her and love her. And when they were hugging, he seen these little children start coming out. They weren't bears, and they were kind of hairy, but they weren't as hairy or ugly as the bears were. And when they come out, he knew immediately that these were her children that she had with one of the bear people. So he turned and looked at the grandmother who brought him to see his daughter, and she fell and laid dead right there in her spot. She just died when he looked at her. And then all the other bears, they bent over, and they could only walk on four legs from that point on. And that's what happened with the bears. His grandchildren, the ones that weren't exactly as ugly as the bears and weren't as beautiful as his daughter, those he made run off into the four different directions, and they became Indian people these days. And that's where Indian people come from. And then he went back in his lodge, and they left, and we've never seen him again. And that's a really neat story. And like I told you, I wanted to tell you a little bit about similarities. And the Cherokee have a similar story about bears. There was a long time ago when there were no bears in our land, and the people basically farmed and harvested a lot of plants and food and fished and hunted. And there was one tribe of Cherokee that went out into the woods, and they lived like bears, and that's what bears became these days. And they basically are Cherokee people, descendants, that live out there. Whenever there's a special group of Cherokee go out and hunt bears, because we use bear fat for a lot of different stuff. But this group that goes out and hunt bears say that it takes a certain kind of person to go do this job, because when you're about to let go of your bow string and release that arrow and kill the bear, they always turn back and look at you and ask you in Cherokee, please don't kill me. So really kind of a neat story. But anyway, I'm going to play the flute here for you in just a second. I wanted to tell you that story, kind of a neat origin story. How much time have we got there? Okay, so it looks like we might have time for one other story. This one is actually a Plains Indian story. It's a Lakota story, and it's actually where our flutes come from. The neat thing about this story, like most of our stories that you may hear from different people, is that this story actually has a lot of truth in it. And you start thinking, wait a minute, maybe the whole story's true. Maybe all of our stories are true. And you start wondering this, and then you start coming to powwows and festivals all the time, and that's your thing. But anyway, a long time ago, there wasn't, just like I mentioned, there were no Indian people here. There was no sound of a flute. Now imagine if you have never heard a flute before in your life. So that's something that you all recognize. You recognize it as a flute. You either played the recorder in your band or in school, or maybe you've heard somebody on TV play it or whatever. You've heard the sound of a flute before. But imagine if there were no instruments except for the thump, thump, thump of a drum, and you've never heard this flute. How unusual it would be to hear such a thing. Well, a long time ago, before the flute came about, there was a man. This man was a very important guy in our culture because he's the one that brought the flute to us. He, like many young Lakota men, was on his way to find out who he was. These days you go to school and go to college, and sometimes you apprentice with people still. It's not as popular as it used to be, but it worked really well for me. But you apprentice with people and learn a new trade or get educated that way. Well, our way of doing it back there was something called a humbletia. The humbletia is a way that you go and search for who it is that you are. And sometimes we have more than one of those in our lifetime. Sometimes we have 4, 8, 10. Some people may not know. I don't know if any of you know people that have gone to college and aren't using their college education for anything. But anyway, sometimes who you are may not be what you think who you are is. And so this guy, he went out on a humbletia. He was guided by one of his family members. Actually took him out to this sacred site, and then this big cleared area, something like the little arena we see right here. In the middle, there was a sacred little circle for him to sit down in. It's been kind of dug away and cleaned up, and he had some things there to protect him, because when you're off and alone by yourself for 4 days and nights without anything to eat or drink and no sleep, sometimes things may could overwhelm you. And likewise, his uncle had kept looking after him, come back and watched him every once in a while to make sure he was okay, although he didn't know his uncle was around. It was his job. It was getting really still and quiet. He hadn't seen any animals out here, which is unusual, he thought, because he's a hunter and was accustomed to seeing the animals in the forest. And all of a sudden he heard something. He looked over in the bushes over there. And as he looked in the bushes, he seen them kind of rustling around, and kind of like that, just a little sound, something rustling in there. And he looked, and he seen it rustling even bigger. And this is day 3. He hasn't eaten or drank anything. He's very tired. And he thinks, well, maybe this is my vision. Maybe this is who I'm going to become. So he jumps up and he takes off in the bushes after this thing, because he's figured, why wait? I'm gonna wait for it to come to me? No, I'm gonna go after it and take it, the bull by the horns, as people say. So he ran off and started chasing it. And he's running through this clearing, through this trail, and eventually he comes out into a big thicket, kind of an open area, and kind of like down here, if you guys haven't walked by Mound B, but there's one right behind it. It's really beautiful, real quiet and still, and there's a river that runs through there, and there's a little patch of river cane that grows back there. And in the patch of river cane, a lot of times there's birds or animals. Lots of spiders live out in the river cane, which is kind of neat. But this time it was really calm and relaxing, and he just sat down by the river cane and took a rest. While he was resting there, there was a breeze blowing, kind of like what we feel right now. If you see those flags moving, there's a little bit of a breeze blowing. And he heard this sound. And he jumped up immediately, looks around for this thing. He's thinking, oh my gosh, what kind of animal or spirit or something's making this sound for me? And he looks everywhere and he doesn't see anything. And in the distance he sees this little woodpecker fly off, but he sees a piece of river cane there, and it was standing up straight like the others, except for there were some little black spots on it, like you probably can see from where you're sitting. And these black spots were little holes in it. So he grabs this piece of river cane and he thinks, well, that's kind of unusual. I haven't seen that before. And he grabs it and he takes it back to his camp. And when he goes back there, he asks everybody, his parents, his uncle that had been looking after him, everyone, and they don't know what it is. They don't know what it does or how it plays or what it, he recognizes it as being something unusual, because it had a little unusual looking piece up here and all these holes in a straight line. And finally they told him, take it to the wisest person in the camp and let's ask them what it is, because they've seen and been around, they've traveled far and wide, they know a lot of everything. And so he took it to the wisest person in the camp, who kind of exhumed it and looked it over and tried to see what it did. And he didn't know what it was. He said, but I'll tell you what. He said, many things that we have in our possession, many holy relics and many of our sacred items, only work in one place where they come from. He said, so take it back there where you found it, and let's see if it works there. So he took it back by itself, and he kind of fastened it back up where it came in the river cane patch, a little thicket there. And all of a sudden, a woodpecker come down, and he lands on the top of it, and he makes some adjustments, and he starts dancing around, and it plays music for him. So he heard that sound and he thought, well, that's great, that's amazing. And the little woodpecker, this creature that he's seen all his life, flies down in front of him and he turns into a little person. And this little person, about so high, starts telling the story about how he was out there eating the larvae of a carpenter bee who had built his nest inside of this piece of river cane. And when he did that, every time he would peck a hole in there, he'd clean it out really nice, and he'd clean out the next one really nice. And every time he did that, it would play a different note. And that's how he made the first flute. And he told him to bring it back to your people and tell them how to make these flutes. And from then on, we have the sound of this instrument. So that's one of the original Lakota stories of the flute. Kind of interesting, because my wife and I, we go out in a lot of river cane patches and have found lots of river cane with woodpecker holes in them. And we thought, woodpeckers pecking holes in river cane? That's not right? But it's true. And it does happen. And it's probably very similar to the way we learned how to play and make the flute. And of course, Cherokee people, likewise from my dad's side of the family, have lots of stories of little people. Anybody that would like to hear any of those or have any more information about whatever we've talked about today, feel free to stop by our booth and we'd be glad to talk to you. Otherwise, I'm going to play a little more contemporary piece of music right now. It's my newest CD. It released yesterday. It's pretty new. It actually arrived here at 1 p.m. in the afternoon, so I was so tickled when FedEx came. But I'm going to play a little piece of that for you, and then I'll turn it over to whoever's next. Thank you guys very much. Feel free to stop by and listen to the rest of the CD if you like. We've got it playing at the booth all day. And any questions, like I say, feel free to stop.